The American YAWP, Chapter 18, The Progressive Era, Section 4, Targeting the Trusts. In one of the defining books of the Progressive Era, The Promise of American Life, Herbert Croly argued that because the corrupt politician has usurped too much of the power which should be exercised by the people, and the millionaire and the trust have appropriated too many of the economic opportunities formerly enjoyed by the people. Croly and other reformers believed that wealth inequality eroded democracy. Reformers had to win back for the people the power usurped by the moneyed trusts. But what exactly were these trusts, and why did it suddenly seem so important to reform them? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a trust was a monopoly or cartel associated with the large corporations of the Gilded and Progressive eras that entered into agreements, legal or otherwise, or consolidations, to exercise exclusive control over a specific product or industry under the control of a single entity. Certain types of monopolies, specifically for intellectual property like copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets, are protected under the Constitution to promote the progress of science and useful arts, but for powerful entities to control entire national markets was something wholly new and for many Americans wholly unsettling. The rapid industrialization, technological advancement, and urban growth of the 1870s and 1880s triggered major changes in the way businesses structured themselves. The Second Industrial Revolution, made possible by available natural resources, growth in the labor supply through immigration, increasing capital, new legal economic entities, novel production strategies, and a growing national market, was commonly asserted to be the natural product of the federal government's laissez-faire, or hands-off, economic policy. An unregulated business climate, the argument went, allowed for the growth of major trusts, most notably Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel, later consolidated with other producers as U.S. Steel, and John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Each displayed the vertical and horizontal integration strategies common to the new trusts. Carnegie first used vertical integration by controlling every phase of business: raw materials, transportation, manufacturing, distribution, and Rockefeller adhered to horizontal integration by buying out competing refineries. Once dominant in a market, critics alleged, the trusts could artificially inflate prices, bully rivals, and bribe politicians. Between 1897 and 1904, over 4,000 companies were consolidated down into 257 corporate firms. As one historian wrote, by 1904, a total of 318 trusts held 40% of U.S. manufacturing assets and boasted a capitalization of $7 billion, 7 times bigger than the U.S. national debt. With the 20th century came the age of monopoly. Mergers and the aggressive business policies of wealthy men such as Carnegie and Rockefeller had earned them the epithet robber barons. Their cutthroat stifling of economic competition, mistreatment of workers, and corruption of politics sparked an opposition that pushed for regulations to rein in the power of monopolies. The great corporations had become a major target of reformers. Big business, whether in meatpacking, railroads, telegraph lines, oil, or steel, posed new problems for the American legal system. Before the Civil War, most businesses operated in a single state. They might ship goods across state lines or to other countries, but they typically had offices and factories in just one state. Individual states naturally regulated industry and commerce, but extensive railroad routes crossed several state lines, and new mass-producing corporations operated across the nation, raising questions about where the authority to regulate such practices rested. During the 1870s, many states passed laws to check the growing power of the vast new corporations. In the Midwest, farmers formed a network of organizations that were part political pressure group, part social club, and part mutual aid society. Together they pushed for the so-called Granger laws that regulated railroads and other new companies. Railroads and other concerns opposed these regulations because they restrained profits and because they made meeting the standards of each state's separate regulatory laws difficult. In 1877, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld these laws in a series of rulings, finding in cases such as Munn v. Illinois and Stone v. Wisconsin that railroads and other companies of such size necessarily affected the public interest and could thus be regulated by individual states. In Munn, the court declared, Property does become clothed with a public interest when used in a manner to make it of public consequence and affect the community at large. When therefore one devoted his property to a use in which the public has an interest, he in effect grants to the public an interest in that use, and must submit to be controlled by the public for the common good, to the extent of the interest he has thus created. Later rulings, however, conceded that only the federal government could constitutionally regulate interstate commerce and the new national businesses operating it. And as more and more power and capital and market share flowed to the great corporations, the onus of regulation passed to the federal government. In 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission to stop discriminatory and predatory pricing practices. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 aimed to limit anti-competitive practices, such as those institutionalized in cartels and monopolistic corporations. It stated that a trust or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce is declared to be illegal, and that those who monopolize any part of the trade or commerce shall be deemed guilty. The Sherman Antitrust Act declared that not all monopolies were illegal, only those that unreasonably stifled free trade. The court seized on the law's vague language, however, and the act was turned against itself, manipulated, and used, for instance, to limit the growing power of labor unions. Only in 1914, with the Clayton Antitrust Act, did Congress attempt to close loopholes in previous legislation. Aggression against the trusts and the progressive vogue for trust busting took on new meaning under the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, a reform-minded Republican who ascended to the presidency after the death of William McKinley in 1901. Roosevelt's youthful energy and confrontational politics captivated the nation. Roosevelt was by no means anti-business. Instead, he envisioned his presidency as a mediator between opposing forces, such as between labor unions and corporate executives. Despite his own wealthy background, Roosevelt pushed for antitrust legislation and regulations, arguing that the courts could not be relied on to break up the trusts. Roosevelt also used his own moral judgment to determine which monopolies he would pursue. Roosevelt believed that there were good and bad trusts, necessary monopolies, and corrupt ones. Although his reputation as a trust buster was exaggerated, he was the first major national politician to go after the trusts. The great corporations, which we have grown to speak of rather loosely as trusts, he said, are the creatures of the state, and the state not only has the right to control them, but it is in duty bound to control them wherever the need of such control is shown. His first target was the Northern Securities Company, a holding trust in which several wealthy bankers, including J. P. Morgan, held a controlling share in all the major railroad companies in the American Northwest. Holding trusts had emerged as a way to circumvent the Sherman Antitrust Act. By controlling the majority of shares rather than the principal, Morgan and his collaborators tried to claim that it was not a monopoly. Roosevelt's administration sued and won in court, and in 1904 the Northern Securities Company was ordered to disband into separate competitive companies. 2 years later, in 1906, Roosevelt signed the Hepburn Act, allowing the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate best practices and set reasonable rates for the railroads. Roosevelt was more interested in regulating corporations than breaking them apart. Besides, the courts were slow and unpredictable. However, his successor after 1908, William Howard Taft, firmly believed in court-oriented trust busting, and during his 4 years in office more than doubled the number of monopoly breakups that occurred during Roosevelt's 7 years in office. Taft notably went after U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, which had been formed via the consolidation of nearly every major American steel producer. Trust busting and the handling of monopolies dominated the election of 1912. When the Republican Party spurned Roosevelt's return to politics and renominated the incumbent Taft, Roosevelt left and formed his own coalition, the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. Whereas Taft took an all-encompassing view on the illegality of monopolies, Roosevelt adopted a new nationalism program which once again emphasized the regulation of already existing corporations by expanding federal authority over the economy. In contrast, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic Party nominee, emphasized in his New Freedom agenda neither trust busting nor federal regulation, but rather small business incentives so that individual companies could increase their competitive chances. Yet once he won the election, Wilson edged nearer to Roosevelt's position, signing the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. The Clayton Antitrust Act substantially enhanced the Sherman Act, specifically regulating mergers and price discrimination and protecting labor's access to collective bargaining and related strategies of picketing, boycotting, and protesting. Congress further created the Federal Trade Commission to enforce the Clayton Act, ensuring at least some measure of implementation. While the three presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, pushed the development and enforcement of antitrust law, their commitments were uneven, and trust busting itself manifested the political pressure put on politicians by the workers, farmers, and progressive writers who so strongly drew attention to the ramifications of trusts and corporate capital on the lives of everyday Americans. Section 5. Progressive Environmentalism. The potential scope of environmental destruction wrought by industrial capitalism was unparalleled in human history. Professional bison hunting expeditions nearly eradicated an entire species, industrialized logging companies denuded whole forests, and chemical plants polluted the water supply of many regions. As American development and industrialization marched westward, reformers embraced environmental protections. Historians often cite preservation and conservation as two competing strategies that dueled for supremacy among environmental reformers during the Progressive Era. The tensions between these two approaches crystallized in the debate over a proposed dam in the Hetch Hetchy Valley in California. The fight revolved around the provision of water for San Francisco. Engineers identified the location where the Tuolumne River ran through Hetch Hetchy as an ideal site for a reservoir. The project had been suggested in the 1880s but picked up momentum in the early 20th century, but the valley was located inside Yosemite National Park. Yosemite was designated a national park in 1890, though the land had been set aside earlier in a grant approved by President Lincoln in 1864. The debate over Hetch Hetchy revealed two distinct positions on the value of the valley and on the purpose of public lands. John Muir, naturalist, writer, and founder of the Sierra Club, invoked the god of the mountains in his defense of the valley in its supposedly pristine condition. Gifford Pinchot, arguably the father of American forestry and a key player in the federal management of national forests, meanwhile emphasized what he understood to be the purpose of conservation: to take every part of the land and its resources and put it to that use in which it will serve the most people. Muir took a wider view of what the people needed, writing that everybody needs beauty as well as bread. 34. These dueling arguments revealed the key differences in environmental thought. Muir, on the side of the preservationists, advocated setting aside pristine lands for their aesthetic and spiritual value, enabling Americans to get in touch with the nerves of Mother Earth. 35 Pinchot, on the other hand, led the charge for conservation, a kind of environmental utilitarianism that emphasized the efficient use of available resources through planning and control and the prevention of waste. In Hetch Hetchy, conservation won out. Congress approved the project in 1913. The dam was built, and the valley was flooded for the benefit of San Francisco residents. While preservation was often articulated as an escape from an increasingly urbanized and industrialized way of life, and as a welcome respite from the challenges of modernity, at least for those who had the means to escape, the conservationists were more closely aligned with broader trends in American society. Although the greatest good for the greatest number was something like the catchphrase of conservation, conservationist policies most often benefited the nation's financial interests. For example, many states instituted game laws to regulate hunting and protect wildlife, but the laws were often unbalanced. In Pennsylvania, local game laws required firearm permits for non-citizens, barred hunting on Sundays, and banned the shooting of songbirds. These laws disproportionately affected Italian immigrants, critics said, as Italians often hunted songbirds for subsistence, worked in mines for low wages every day but Sunday, and were too poor to purchase permits or to pay the fines levied against them when game wardens caught them in the act. Other laws, for example, offered up resources to businesses at costs prohibitive to all but the wealthiest companies and individuals, or with regulatory requirements that could be met only by companies with extensive resources. But progressive era environmentalism addressed more than the management of American public lands. After all, reformers addressing issues facing the urban poor were also doing environmental work. Settlement house workers like Jane Addams and Florence Kelley focused on questions of health and sanitation, while activists concerned with working conditions, most notably Dr. Alice Hamilton, investigated both worksite hazards and occupational and bodily harm. The progressives' commitment to the provision of public services at the municipal level meant more coordination and oversight in matters of public health, waste management, and even playgrounds and city parks. Their work focused on the intersection of communities and their material environments, highlighting the urgency of urban environmental concerns. While reform movements focused their attention on the urban poor, other efforts targeted rural communities. The Country Life movement, spearheaded by Cornell University professor Liberty Hyde Bailey, sought to support agrarian families and encourage young people to stay in their communities and run family farms. The movement sought to modernize country schools and develop agricultural extension programs to share scientific advances with American farmers. At the same time, progressive educators such as Bailey and his Cornell colleague Anna Botsford Comstock advocated for nature study. In line with their desire that Americans study nature, not books, they took students outside to experience natural processes and to help them develop observational skills and an appreciation for the natural world. Other examples highlight the interconnectedness of urban and rural communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The extinction of the North American passenger pigeon reveals the complexity of progressive era relationships between people and nature. Passenger pigeons were actively hunted, prepared at New York's finest restaurants and in the humblest of farm kitchens. Some hunted them for pay, others shot them in competitions at sporting clubs, and then they were gone, their ubiquity giving way only to nostalgia. Many Americans took notice at the great extinction of a species that had perhaps numbered in the billions and then was eradicated. Women in Audubon Society chapters organized against the fashion of wearing feathers, even whole birds on ladies' hats. Upper and middle class women made up the lion's share of the membership of these societies. They used their social standing to fight for birds. Pressure created national wildlife refuges and key laws and regulations that included the Lacey Act of 1900, banning the shipment of species killed illegally across state lines. Examining how women mobilized contemporary notions of womanhood in the service of protecting birds reveals a tangle of cultural and economic processes. Such examples also reveal the range of ideas, policies, and practices wrapped up in figuring out what and who American nature should be for. Section 6. Jim Crow and African American Life. America's tragic racial history was not erased by the progressive era. In fact, in all too many ways, reform removed African Americans ever farther from American public life. In the South, electoral politics remained a parade of electoral fraud, voter intimidation, and race baiting. Democratic Party candidates stirred Southern whites into frenzies with warnings of Negro domination and of black men violating white women. The region's culture of racial violence and the rise of lynching as a mass public spectacle accelerated. And as the remaining African American voters threatened the dominance of Democratic leadership in the South, Southern Democrats turned to what many white Southerners understood as a series of progressive electoral and social reforms, disenfranchisement, and segregation. Just as reformers would clean up politics by taming city political machines, white Southerners would purify the ballot box by restricting black voting, and they would prevent racial strife by legislating the social separation of the races. The strongest supporters of such measures in the South were progressive Democrats and former populists, both of whom saw in these reforms a way to eliminate the racial demagoguery that conservative Democratic Party leaders had so effectively wielded. Leaders in both the North and South embraced and proclaimed the reunion of the sections on the basis of white supremacy. As the nation took up the white man's burden to uplift the world's racially inferior peoples, the North looked to the South as an example of how to manage non-white populations. The South had become the nation's racial vanguard. The question was how to accomplish disfranchisement. The 15th Amendment clearly prohibited states from denying any citizen the right to vote on the basis of race. In 1890, a Mississippi state newspaper called on politicians to devise some legal defensible substitute for the abhorrent and evil methods on which white supremacy lies. The state's Democratic Party responded with a new state constitution designed to purge corruption at the ballot box through disenfranchisement. African Americans hoping to vote in Mississippi would have to jump through a series of hurdles designed with the explicit purpose of excluding them from political power. The state first established a poll tax, which required voters to pay for the privilege of voting. Second, it stripped suffrage from those convicted of the petty crimes most common among the state's African Americans. Next, the state required voters to pass a literacy test. Local voting officials, who were themselves part of the local party machine, were responsible for judging whether voters were able to read and understand a section of the Constitution. In order to protect illiterate whites from exclusion, the so-called Understanding Clause allowed a voter to qualify if they could adequately explain the meaning of a section that was read to them. In practice, these rules were systematically abused to the point where local election officials effectively wielded the power to permit and deny suffrage at will. The disenfranchisement laws effectively moved electoral conflict from the ballot box, where public attention was greatest, to the voting registrar, where supposedly colorblind laws allowed local party officials to deny the ballot without the appearance of fraud. Between 1895 and 1908, the rest of the states in the South approved new constitutions, including these disenfranchisement tools. 6 southern states also added a grandfather clause, which bestowed suffrage on anyone whose grandfather was eligible to vote in 1867. This ensured that whites who would have been otherwise excluded through mechanisms such as poll taxes or literacy tests would still be eligible, at least until grandfather clauses were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1915. Finally, each southern state adopted an all-white primary and excluded Black Americans from the Democratic primary, the only political contest that mattered across much of the South. For all the legal double talk, the purpose of these laws was plain. James Kimball Vardaman, later governor of Mississippi, boasted that there is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter. Mississippi's Constitutional Convention was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the nigger from politics. Not the ignorant, but the nigger. These technically colorblind tools did their work well. In 1900, Alabama had 121,159 literate Black men of voting age. Only 3,742 were registered to vote. Louisiana had 130,000 Black voters in the contentious election of 1896. 4 years later, it had only 5,320. Black people were clearly the target of these laws, but that did not prevent some whites from being disenfranchised as well. Louisiana dropped 80,000 white voters over the same period. Most politically engaged Southern whites considered this a price worth paying to prevent the alleged fraud that plagued the region's elections. At the same time that the South's Democratic leaders were adopting the tools to disenfranchise the region's Black voters, these same legislatures were constructing a system of racial segregation even more pernicious. While it built on earlier practice, segregation was primarily a modern and urban system of enforcing racial subordination and deference. In rural areas, white and Black Southerners negotiated the meaning of racial difference within the context of personal relationships, of kinship and patronage. An African American who broke the local community's racial norms could expect swift personal sanction that often included violence. The crop lien and convict lease systems were the most important legal tools of racial control in the rural South. Maintaining white supremacy there did not require segregation. Maintaining white supremacy within the city, however, was a different matter altogether. As the region's railroad networks and cities expanded, so too did the anonymity and therefore freedom of Southern Black people. Southern cities were becoming a center of Black middle-class life that was an implicit threat to racial hierarchies. White Southerners created the system of segregation as a way to maintain white supremacy in restaurants, theaters, public restrooms, schools, water fountains, train cars, and hospitals. Segregation inscribed the superiority of whites and the deference of Black people into the very geography of public spaces. In addition, prominent writers and artists elevated the idea of racial uplift, undercutting white supremacist representations of African Americans mainstreaming in popular culture. Born in Illinois in 1884, Oscar Miko embodied the spirit of a new generation of African Americans not born into slavery. After working as a Pullman car porter in Chicago and homesteading in South Dakota, he shifted gears and became a prolific fiction writer and filmmaker. He published 7 novels and produced 45 films during the silent film era. To a reporter at the New York Amsterdam News, Michaud proclaimed, "I'm tired of reading about the Negro in an inferior position in society. I want to see them in dignified roles. Also, I want to see the white man and the white woman as the villains." Michaud is best known for his film Within Our Gates, 1920, which offered a stinging critique of the grotesquely racist film The Birth of a Nation, which had premiered 5 years earlier. Taking place in the urban North and rural South, Within Our Gates follows the life of Sylvia Landry, a reputable, educated Black woman seeking support from Northern philanthropists to fund a school for the children of Black sharecroppers. While in the North, she meets an honorable Black man named Mr. Vivian, who discovers that Sylvia's hardworking, honest parents were lynched by local whites who mistakenly believed Mr. Landry murdered the white landowner he worked for. While the brutal lynching of her parents is taking place, Sylvia is assaulted by the white landowner's brother and barely escapes being raped. Not only did Within Our Gates portray most African Americans as upstanding, cultured men and women, but the film also condemned Southern racial violence, the sexual assault of Black women, and the grinding poverty of sharecropping. Michaud's films contested vicious stereotypes of African Americans and communicated a message of racial uplift designed to inspire pride in one's race. Racial uplift strategies failed to deter Southern whites from erecting the apparatus of Jim Crow. Of course, as with disenfranchisement, segregation violated a plain reading of the Constitution, in this case the 14th Amendment. Here the Supreme Court intervened, ruling in the civil rights cases, 1883, that the 14th Amendment only prevented discrimination directly by states. It did not prevent discrimination by individuals, businesses, or other entities. Southern states exploited this interpretation with the first legal segregation of railroad cars in 1888. In a case that reached the Supreme Court in 1896, New Orleans resident Homer Plessy challenged the constitutionality of Louisiana's segregation of streetcars. The court ruled against Plessy and in the process established the legal principle of separate but equal. Racially segregated facilities were legal provided they were equivalent. In practice, this was almost never the case. The court's majority defended its position with logic that reflected the racial assumptions of the day. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the court explained, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. Justice John Harlan, the lone dissenter, countered, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." Harlan went on to warn that the court's decision would permit the seeds of race hatred to be planted under the sanction of law. In their rush to fulfill Harlan's prophecy, Southern whites codified and enforced the segregation of public spaces. Segregation was built on a fiction that there could be a white South socially and culturally distinct from African Americans. Its legal basis rested on the constitutional fallacy of separate but equal. Southern whites erected a bulwark of white supremacy that would last for nearly 60 years. Segregation and disenfranchisement in the South rejected Black citizenship and relegated Black social and cultural life to segregated spaces. African Americans lived divided lives, acting the part whites demanded of them in public, while maintaining their own world apart from whites. This segregated world provided a measure of independence for the region's growing Black middle class, yet at the cost of poisoning the relationship between Black and white. Segregation and disenfranchisement created entrenched structures of racism that completed the total rejection of the promises of Reconstruction. Born into the world of bondage in Virginia in 1856, Booker Taliaferro Washington was subjected to the degradation and exploitation of slavery early in life. But Washington also developed an insatiable thirst to learn. Working against tremendous odds, Washington matriculated into Hampton University in Virginia and thereafter established a Southern institution that would educate many Black Americans, the Tuskegee Institute, located in Alabama. Washington envisioned that Tuskegee's contribution to Black life would come through industrial education and vocational training. He believed that such skills would help African Americans accomplish economic independence while developing a sense of self-worth and pride of accomplishment, even while living within the putrid confines of Jim Crow. Washington poured his life into Tuskegee and thereby connected with leading white philanthropic interests. Individuals such as Andrew Carnegie, for instance, financially assisted Washington in his educational ventures. Washington became a leading spokesperson for Black Americans at the turn of the 20th century, particularly after Frederick Douglass's death in early 1895. Washington's famous Atlanta Compromise speech from that same year encouraged Black Americans to cast your bucket down to improve life's lot under segregation. In the same speech, delivered 1 year before the Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision that legalized segregation under the separate but equal doctrine, Washington said to white Americans, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." Washington was both praised as a race leader and pilloried as an accommodationist to America's unjust racial hierarchy. His public advocacy of a conciliatory posture toward white supremacy concealed the efforts to which he went to assist African Americans in the legal and economic quest for racial justice. In addition to founding Tuskegee, Washington also published a handful of influential books, including the autobiography Up from Slavery, 1901. Like Du Bois, Washington was also active in Black journalism, working to fund and support Black newspaper publications, most of which sought to counter Du Bois's growing influence. Washington died in 1915 during World War I of ill health in Tuskegee, Alabama. Speaking decades later, Du Bois said that Washington had, in his 1895 compromise speech, implicitly abandoned all political and social rights. "I never thought Washington was a bad man. I believed him to be sincere, though wrong." Du Bois would directly attack Washington in his classic 1903 The Souls of Black Folk, but at the turn of the century, he could never escape the shadow of his longtime rival. "I admired much about him," Du Bois admitted. "Washington died in 1915. A lot of people think I died at the same time," and Du Bois became one of America's foremost intellectual leaders on questions of social justice by producing scholarship that underscored the humanity of African Americans. Du Bois's work as an intellectual scholar and college professor began during the Progressive Era, a time in American history marked by rapid social and cultural change as well as complex global political conflicts and developments. Du Bois addressed these domestic and international concerns not only in his classrooms at Wilberforce University in Ohio and Atlanta University in Georgia, but also in a number of his early publications on the history of the transatlantic slave trade and Black life in urban Philadelphia. The best known of these early works included The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, and Darkwater, 1920. In these books, Du Bois combined incisive historical analysis with engaging literary drama to validate Black personhood and attack the inhumanity of white supremacy, particularly in the lead-up to and during World War I. In addition to publications and teaching, Du Bois set his sights on political organizing for civil rights, first with the Niagara Movement and later with its offspring, the NAACP. Du Bois's main work with the NAACP lasted from 1909 to 1934 as editor of The Crisis, one of America's leading Black publications. Du Bois attacked Washington and urged Black Americans to concede nothing, to make no compromises, and advocate for equal rights under the law. Throughout his early career, he pushed for civil rights legislation, launched legal challenges against discrimination, organized protests against injustice, and applied his capacity for clear research and sharp prose to expose the racial sins of Progressive-era America. We refuse to allow the impression to remain that the Negro American assents to inferiority, is submissive under oppression, and apologetic before insults. Any discrimination based simply on race or color is barbarous. We care not how hallowed it be by custom, expediency, or prejudice. Discriminations based simply and solely on physical peculiarities, place of birth, color of skin, are relics of that unreasoning human savagery of which the world is and ought to be thoroughly ashamed. Persistent manly agitation is the way to liberty. W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington made a tremendous historical impact and left a notable historical legacy. They were reared under markedly different circumstances, and thus their early life experiences and even personal temperaments oriented the two leaders' lives and outlooks in decidedly different ways. Du Bois's confrontational voice boldly targeted white supremacy. He believed in the power of social science to arrest the reach of white supremacy. Washington advocated incremental change for longer-term gain. He contended that economic self-sufficiency would pay off at a future date. 4 years after Du Bois directly spoke out against Washington in the chapter of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Souls of Black Folk, the two men shared the same lectern at the Philadelphia Divinity School to address matters of race, history, and culture in the American South. Although their philosophies often differed, both men inspired others to demand that America live up to its democratic creed. Section 7. Conclusion. Industrial capitalism unleashed powerful forces in American life, along with wealth, technological innovation, and rising standards of living. A host of social problems unsettled many who turned to reform politics to set the world right again. The Progressive Era signaled that a turning point had been reached for many Americans who were suddenly willing to confront the age's problems with national political solutions. Reformers sought to bring order to chaos, to bring efficiency to inefficiency, and to bring justice to injustice. Causes varied, constituencies shifted, and the tangible effects of so much energy was difficult to measure. But the Progressive Era signaled a bursting of long-simmering tensions and introduced new patterns in the relationship between American society, American culture, and American politics.